G'day YouTube, Warbles on a lot here with the second part of a fairly interesting article in November 2014's Air and Space Smithsonian magazine concerning the difficulties involved in landing humans on Mars. I'm going to commence reading here with landing humans on Mars, while you get the groovy, juicy graphic of the supersonic parachute test rig described at the end of the previous video to look at. Landing humans on Mars would be a much tougher problem. To kick off our panel's first session, after everyone had introduced himself or herself and provided a brief background, I asked them all to share what I called their, quote, "careabouts," unquote. What did they think the major issues were? Ken Joosten, a brilliant design architect of human Mars missions, explained NASA's, quote, "short and long stay," quote, mission designs. Long stays would require the astronauts to be on Mars for 545 days, bracket 430 Martian days or sols, close bracket, and away from Earth for 2.5 years. Short stays would require, quote, "only," unquote, 40 days on the surface and a little more than 1.5 years away from home. In either case, the stuff that needed to be landed for the astronauts would be massive. From Kent, we heard the description of a whole stocked-up camp that would be placed robotically prior to the astronauts' arrival. To save weight, water would be extracted from the Martian air, and the oxidizer for the fuel needed to take off for the journey back to Earth would be manufactured on Mars. Radioactive power plants and solar arrays would be brought in by spacecraft, ready to be set up by humans. Even the crew's Mars ascent vehicle for the return home would be positioned in advance, fueled and ready to go. Jack Schmidt next took the floor and explained what a Mars mission would look like from an astronaut's point of view. Now you get to look at the sky crane maneuver that put Curiosity on the surface of Mars. Being in space was lonely enough, he said. Astronauts would need people to talk to, people in mission control to help work them through the tough spots. But mission control in Houston is between 11 and 22 light minutes away, depending on where Mars and Earth are located in their orbits. You could talk for 10 or 20 minutes before the first word you uttered ever arrived in an Earthling's ears. An unexpected issue surfaced when Jack commented, quote, "To do this landing safely, of course, we need the ability for the astronauts at any time to hit the abort button, wave off the landing approach, and go back into outer space," unquote. Bobby, Dick, and I glanced at one another, appalled, and we all looked at Jack with stunned expressions that translated as, quote, "What? Are you kidding? How the heck could you do that?" unquote. With Mars landers, aborting raises a much bigger problem than the landing. All of our Mars landers and rovers, as they approached the planet, shed an assemblage of intricate hardware and components, leaving a trail of debris on the way to the surface. We assumed that a human mission would do the same. How could it do all of those transformations and undressings while still being able to turn around to fly back up into outer space in an emergency? When we explained that the Mars entry was more like a landing on Earth than a landing on the Moon, the astronauts were quite surprised. We gave them an explanation that went something like this. Imagine you're going at Mach 15 surrounded by a bubble of hot gas as you plunge through the Martian upper atmosphere. You're decelerating at up to 6 Gs. If you wanted to change your mind and head back to space, how would you do that? You're going so fast, there's no way to undress yourself from the heat shield and turn your craft into a rocket. Worse, you're headed in the wrong direction going extremely fast. The amount of fuel you would have to have at that point to get back into space would be enormous," unquote. The robotic ED-Ellers in the crowd were thrown for another loop when Shuttle Astronaut Commander Barry Butch Wilmore argued the need for the astronauts to be able to take over control during the landing on Mars, just as Neil Armstrong had to do during the first lunar landing. I know that if I were an astronaut, I'd want to be able to control my spaceship. But those of us who design rovers to land on Mars also know that those landings are nothing like landing on the Moon or landing the space shuttle back on Earth. The Martian atmosphere is shallow. Its top is so close to the surface of the planet that events during the landing unfold at lightning speed. We're talking about an astronaut who's been travelling through deep space in zero gravity for well over a year and is now undergoing extreme entry deceleration. Silicon chips running at 120 million operations a second can handle it, but I would not expect any human, not even a highly trained, exceptionally fit astronaut, to be able to do the same. The entire sequence of events for entry, descent, and landing would almost certainly need to be automated. Over the course of the next few months, we gathered for 2 additional multi-day workshops. Gradually, we started to home in on a few key observations and details about putting human-scale landers on Mars. What became clear to me was that in the 50 years of its existence, NASA had never really had the focus, resources, or real Mars landing experiences to study these problems clearly. One issue that was primary for me is representative of the back and forth that the panel went through on many topics. The items astronauts would need for a longer stay would fill pages and include food, fuel, oxygen, energy, breathable air, some type of living quarters, roving equipment, and a return vehicle. Even if we counted on pre-supply missions, they would probably require a spacecraft of 30 to 70 metric tons. How could we possibly bring that much stuff to a stop at a precise location on Mars? When the conversation turned to decelerating from supersonic speeds, the first item addressed was parachutes. In the group were 2 of the nation's leading experts in parachute design. Juan Cruz from the NASA Langley Space Center in Virginia is a part-time professor at Georgia Tech and has a reputation as NASA's best expert for supersonic parachutes and supersonic deceleration. He and I knew each other well since he had worked on the chutes for Spirit and Opportunity and was deeply involved in the design analysis for the MSL parachute. We also had on the panel a long-time builder of Mars parachutes, Al Witkowski of Pioneer Aerospace, or Pioneer Airspace. He's one of the world's most prolific designers of aerospace chutes. Juan explained the fundamentals and design limitation of large supersonic chutes. He reminded us that the largest ever tested supersonically was about 85 feet in diameter. But the people who had been asked to do Mars EDL simulations years earlier reminded us that they had done computer studies of simulated but much larger parachutes that would allow a human-scale lander to slow down from somewhere just above Mach 3 to less than Mach 1 over a few tens of seconds, but with a rather large back-breaking jerk as the parachute inflated. Al and Juan just laughed. Juan told them, quote, "We cannot scale parachutes up to the size of the Rose Bowl, not without understanding the physics of parachute deployment and inflation of something that size. We cannot even say that the parachute will open in time before the lander hits the ground," unquote. I asked Juan, quote, "Are you telling us we do not have any parachute solution for going from supersonic speed down to subsonic speed for a large-scale lander?" Quote, question mark, quote, "That's right," quote, he said. The room went silent. We created a subgroup to brainstorm various technology options to address the issue of slowing. Its members came back with an alphabet soup of possible technologies. Give you a look at a self-portrait of curiosity. But by then it was beginning to sink in. At this stage, none of the experts was able to offer a single effective way of slowing down. We spent the last day brainstorming a schedule or timeline that we would need to solve the EDL problem and get it to the point that it would be usable for landing humans on Mars. We figured that, like the Apollo project, 1 or more Earth flight tests of bits and pieces of the full-scale EDL design would be required. Although I was not a big fan of the idea, the team also assumed that we would at some point land at least one smaller robotic Mars mission to test some of the new technologies. When you stacked all these up and counted forward, we calculated that the final EDL design concept, not the design, just the design concept, knowing what you want to design, would have to be ready by 2015. On that timetable, the first human footprints would not appear on the Martian soil until about 2032, and that would be if the project were funded soon. But it was not. Budgetary worries aside, in these fascinating workshops spread over 6 months, my human planetary roadmap team had created guidelines for dealing with some of the more challenging technical problems we'll face in the effort to land humans on Mars. As an outcome of our efforts, some of the needed technologies are actually being developed right now. Not all of them, some of them. So the Mars dilemma is that there's no technology to achieve the mission goals. What it means is it doesn't matter how much any of you out there may have enjoyed reading Kim Stanley Robinson's trilogy of Red Mars, Green Mars, and Blue Mars, and I read a borrowed copy of Blue Mars and I had to give it back. It doesn't matter how much you enjoyed reading it. It was space opera. It was fiction, not science. I personally got a window of insight into the bullshit content of Kim Stanley Robinson's output when I was reading Red Mars, which featured one of these airships, although the one described was an arrowhead-shaped airship which used aerodynamic lift as well as aerostatic lift from the helium gas it was supposed to be filled with. Why you'd want to use helium on Mars when hydrogen is half the weight and will do twice the lifting, you wouldn't know. But anyway, the scenario was that the crew of the airship, which was powered by electric motors fed by solar panels on the upper surface, were on a mission to circumnavigate the planet and install wind turbines with electric heaters to try and terraform Mars by warming the atmosphere. And they were in a dust storm. And in the dust storm, their solar panels weren't getting enough light to make the electricity to run the motors to generate the airspeed, to generate the aerodynamic lift to stop them from having to land. But the dust storm had violent winds and they couldn't land during the winds or the airship might be destroyed. And Kim Stanley Robinson came up with a marvellous idea of having the crew go out on the external skin of the airship and install the little wind turbines and wire all the wind turbines' electric output to go into the battery so that the slipstream generated by the propellers pushing the thing forward would turn the windmills, which would make electricity, which could feed the batteries, to feed the motors, to generate the airflow. It was a perpetual motion machine. He was trying to lift his left foot off the ground by pulling on his bootlace, and once he got it up, grab a hold of the other bootlace and lift the other foot up. It was like having a four-wheeled cart with a sail at one end and a balloon to blow on the sail and thinking that it's going to cross the room. It'll go nowhere until the mast and sail falls off and then it goes backwards. Kim Stanley Robinson was a total bullshit artist with some really great literary skills for writing space opera. Comic space opera. No science in the fiction at all. He apparently had zero knowledge of aeronautical or aerospace engineering. Perhaps he's one of those people who are afraid of flying or something and he never bothered to read up on the technology because it scared him, but he just wanted to be a sci-fi author anyway. Fact is, humans are not going to go to Mars because we can't stop when we get there. We're going too fast to be able to land. You might be able to go up there and do a few orbits and come back, but really what's the point of it when the pressing issue facing humanity is global warming? Anyway, warbles on a lot to YouTube. There you go. That's the end of the Mars fantasy. Ciao.